30 years ago, this is where it started. We're here now. The most inclusive, diverse, accessible film festival we have ever had. This year, I think, is, I feel like it's magical. There's something very magical about a lot of the interactions, not only the films, but just the relationships that are being started, friendships that are being started, and others that are, being cultivated. And I think that accessibility is not something that's coming up later, right? It's not like we're going to discuss these things and then we're going to get to accessibility. That doesn't work anymore. And it's not going to work anymore because it is the front. If it's not given its priority, people are falling off. The women at this table are breaking barriers. And there are a lot of things that have happened literally because of them doing everything they can in their power to make sure that they happen. There are quite a few people that I know, a lot of us know right now, that because of the altitude, because of the environment, because of health, because of different reasons, they are not able to be here with us in Park City. That's a very real thing that Juliet and I have talked about in terms of the people that can't be with us right now, that have worked their butts off all year to be here. So I think that's a great way to begin about accessibility. Having festivals now back in person, right, after COVID, where does that put accessibility?
One of the biggest fears that I had, and I was expressed with Taylor when I saw that, the world was opening back up, was that we would be left behind. Like, this was, during the pandemic, although we were all inside, I had never felt more seen in my life. We were able to have this level playing field where people somehow could empathize with people with disabilities because they now had to structure their life in a way that we've already been structuring our life, right? Well, we can't go outside, let's bring it to Zoom and have a conversation. We were still virtual, everything was virtual. But once they started to open up, my fear was, we can't go back. We can't go back to what people call normal, because then we get called abnormal again. We can't go back. What exactly are we trying to go back to? Because accessibility for one is accessibility for everyone. That's it.
Building on Juliet's point, something we were talking about beforehand, all of us, when we got on Zoom, was 2020 made a lot of changes in DEIA across the board in our industry, from studios down to the smallest nonprofit film festival. We were learning and building on tools and systems that folks with disabilities have been using for decades. Folks with disabilities were the ones that people turn to on how to work remotely, how to build remote working, how to communicate, how to work together. And so I think there was this thing that we're all battling with, is this fear of what happens when we all say, okay, we're back to normal, we no longer need to fund these initiatives. We see studios rolling back DEIA departments, they're stopping to fund diversity, equity, inclusion. So it's one point that we got here, but to Juliet's point, we're going back to this normal that has not served not only people with disabilities, but other marginalized communities, BIPOC folks, LGBTQ folks, trans, non-binary, and disabled-led filmmakers and their audiences. At a time when festivals are struggling to get audiences back, why would you turn your back on a quarter of the population that has buying power and that could be an audience when you're struggling?
Right.
Here's an audience that's craving digital content, craving accessible content. Like, why not be that leader and do what Slamdance and Unstoppable and other folks are doing and say, we're not going back, we're actually going to build new audiences and more revenue streams. And so I think people look at this like, oh, our budgets are shrinking, so this is the last thing we added was accessibility, so it's the first thing we're removing. And it's such a short-sighted way of thinking.
When you're a leader in your community, I don't care if it's 40 people, 8 people, 2 people, it's up to us, I think, to not forget where we started, which was I was going to be a nurse, okay? I was quitting the business. That's where I was. I had given up. You know, I'm legally blind. My wife has some things going on. She's also a filmmaker, and you know, I don't actually know that many people that don't have some things going on, and COVID was delightful for me. I actually loved it. You know, I got friends that are serious OCD directors, like really bad. They loved COVID, like debilitating OCD, to the point where they couldn't even almost leave their house. So, and we know this about groups of people in our industry, and I think it's, you know, really important to continue to learn about our neighbors, our people in our lives and our family, to learn more about what their disability is. Just because you can't see a disability doesn't mean it's not there. You need to look around and recognize there are beautiful, amazing stories all around you, not in your world. And we have to support those stories. It's very important.
My advice to folks is like, great, you have an accessible location. Why isn't that in the invitation? Why aren't you sharing that information up front? Why, you know, or have, you know, advice I give to all organizations, and I think film festivals should really do this, is at the bottom of your invite, just say, have an access need, you know, contact real name at email address or phone number. You know, both options, because depending on the disability, email or phone might be easier, and sending it to a real person, not just an info app. And because that signals to folks that may have an access need that this organization is open to working with you.
Yes.
They may or may not be able to accommodate you depending on other circumstances, but they sure will try to, you know, and such, in as much as humanly possible.
So I grew up with a hearing loss, and then sometime when I was like maybe 12, I remember going to the doctor and the doctor telling me I didn't have a hearing loss anymore. And I was like, cool. And I had primarily been focused on, are there captions and is the space physically accessible? And it is so much more than that, which I think is a real opportunity, because that means that festivals who are in, you know, like in Park City, right, historic spaces that maybe have, you know, too many stairs and are not physically mobile, there may be a lot of ways to make your event accessible in other ways that, you know, maybe you can't build in an elevator, but you can, you know, like bring in captions. You can consider, I was talking with someone this morning about people who have airborne allergies, right? Like you can share the menu in advance. That's kind of like how I came to it. And certainly at FFA, we are by no means perfect, and you know, sometimes it'll be like last minute, and you know, we're like, oh my God, we're about to send out this email and we forgot to put the accessibility information on it, and so we do it and everything, but like we're thinking about it. And that's what I would ask film festivals at this point, right? Like just think about it. And like if everyone is thinking about accessibility, then it makes it not a heavy lift, because it's across.
So kind of feeding off that with like building a strategic plan for accessibility, I think that is really key. And obviously, like Lauren is saying, universal design, thinking of something from the beginning. But what might work for Slamdance may not work for Sundance, even if they're in the same city, right? So this is where something like the scorecard comes into play, where we would like you all to take the scorecard, so take a picture of this QR code. The festivals that have signed up, including Slamdance, will get that anonymous direct feedback, so they will be able to see what their audience that is already coming needs. So they can balance that feedback with their budget, their other perspectives. They can use that information when planning the next festival, because there are general accessibility things we can all advise everyone to do. But like we've all of us here have different experiences with disabilities and could tell you what makes an experience accessible for us, but that may not be what's best for your audience. Because I think Barbara's right, it gets really overwhelming when you think about the scope of disability, right? Of all of the potential needs. And I think that ends up freezing people, and they don't move forward. They're like, there's too much, I don't know where to start, I can't make everyone happy, I'm just gonna do nothing. And I think that's what all of us want to not happen, right?
Yeah. And I'll say on the fear thing, often is coming from able-bodied people who are afraid of doing the wrong thing. And if you have someone who's disabled on your staff, if you have a board member who is disabled, then they're part of the conversation. And I think that's really important because that often doesn't happen. So you're able-bodied and you're trying to do this accessibility stuff and you're like, oh, I don't know what to do. And, it's like, well, if you had someone with like real hand experience, like they would be in the room and they would be helping you.
When it comes to funding, there's funding for LGBTQ filmmakers, funding for BIPOC filmmakers, and they always separate out every category, right? They make us fight over limited resources together, even though especially disability is intersectional in that, right? And so it's really interesting as well, you have federal grants like the National Endowment for the Arts. They require anything that's funded by them to be accessible because they're part of the federal government, which means things need to meet basic ADA requirements. But there is no enforcement of that. There's nobody that checks up on that makes sure everything is accessible, and there's no funding for the accessibility of the program. So you're saying I can legally discriminate against people because I've met these basic minimums, which are not actually servicing. So rather than embracing disability as something that you think of for everybody, universal design from anything, like Lauren was saying, that ramp into your theater is gonna help your projection team load in the projector. They're gonna help the catering staff bring in carts of food and water. Like, thinking about accessibility is not this separate thing that I have to think about, but as something that is incorporated into everything that I think about. It will then bring in more BIPOC, LGBTQ, women, trans, non-binary folks because of that intersectionality, rather than looking at disabled as this additional separate thing that has to have some energy towards.
So when we talked a little bit about this discussion, we said that we will want to, not that it's over, but we'll want to end a little bit on a positive note because there's definitely a little bit too many challenges yet. And we said that I'll represent a little bit of the optimistic thing and just share two things that are related to my documentary. One is that the film is about 3 people, but the 4th character is actually the beautiful, fully accessible house that the star of my film lives in. And it was designed by her own husband, who is an architect, and he actually was the first one to teach me about universal design. And he said, I just designed for Nina, and if it works for her, it's gonna work for most people. And the other thing is that I got to experience with Nina the Paralympics. And that was incredible, a world that was designed for Paralympic athletes of all different disabilities. And again, people just had a blast there. And part of the film is when they talk about other places where she needs help, and she says, well, it's not me who needs fixing. Fix the world. I'll be comfortable going anywhere I want. But it can be done, and when it's done well, it's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's proof that environment is disabling, not a disability.
Absolutely.
Right.
So, yeah.